What if there was a moment, not measured in seconds but in silence, when the earth exhaled something final? Not in fire or noise, but in the slow suffocation of possibility. A stillness so vast it swallowed nearly all the stories life had been writing for hundreds of millions of years. What if nearly everything simply stopped? Not because of war, not because of a comet, but because the planet changed its mind. Because balance, once taken for granted, began to unravel molecule by molecule, breath by breath. It didn't happen overnight, not in human terms. But in the language of deep time, it was sudden, swift, shattering. Almost everything that swam, crawled, burrowed, or bloomed disappeared from the record, as though Earth had turned a page and left the last chapter blank. And yet, something didn't vanish. Something held on. A lineage of breath. A single spark of stubborn biology. Life, in some form, endured quietly, invisibly, without applause. It didn't roar back. It whispered forward. In microbes clinging to sediment. In spores waiting beneath ash. In gills adapting slowly to new chemical tides. Life refused to forget itself. Not entirely. They call it the Great Dying, the Permian-Triassic extinction event. The worst known extinction in the history of this world. Nearly 90 of marine species, 70 of land vertebrates. Gone. We say gone as if it were simple. But how do you truly describe a loss that large? How do you imagine an ocean with no fish, a forest without sound, a sky no longer stirred by wings? The cause, like so many things ancient, is both known and unknown. Theories swirl like ancient dust. Siberian lava fields pouring heat into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide turning oceans acidic, methane rising from melting clathrates in the sea. A cascade of shifts, each one nudging the next, until the world could no longer keep up. Oxygen dwindled, temperatures soared. The ocean, once a womb, became a tomb. And still, something remained. We think of survival as strength. Teeth, claws, fire. But sometimes survival is soft, unseen. A single cell in the right place. A genetic quirk. A behavior unnoticed until it matters. Sometimes, it is the things we overlook. The small, the slow, the quiet that persist. Not because they are powerful, but because they are patient. What if survival in that era meant forgetting what came before? What if the only way to move forward was to erase the past from memory, to carry forward only instinct and structure, not identity? Could it be that life did not endure as itself, but as a shadow of itself? A genetic echo, waiting for new conditions, new languages, new forms? We see it now in rock, in layers of sediment that stretch across continents like scars, telling a story in trace metals and isotopic shifts. Geology remembers what we cannot. It doesn't blink. It doesn't lie. It just layers truth one grain at a time. And within those layers, there is a silence, a gap, a hush in the fossil record where there should have been noise, bones, shells, tracks. Instead, absence. But absence is not nothing. Absence tells us that something was once there, that it mattered, that its loss left a shape behind, like the space a vanished river leaves in the land, like a voice once heard, now missing. Entropy, the slow unraveling of structure, whispers through every extinction. Left alone long enough, everything breaks down. But life doesn't obey entropy perfectly. It fights back, with replication, with mutation, with chance. What if the only reason we're here now, breathing, thinking, wondering, is because a single organism 252 million years ago made a mistake that helped it survive? And so we come to the edge of that moment, the breath between before and after, the hinge where the world tilted, and we ask, what allowed life to continue? Was it will? Was it luck? Was it inevitability written into the physics of molecules and membranes? We may never know, but we can feel it, in the rocks beneath our feet, in the air that holds just enough oxygen, in the lineage of our cells. We are not separate from that ancient hush. We are the continuation of what endured it. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? There was a time, before memory, before anything with eyes to see or lungs to breathe, when Earth itself began to fall out of rhythm. Not suddenly, not with a crash, but with a long, slow unraveling. A quiet imbalance, a steady shift in breath. Somewhere in deep time, the planet began to suffocate. It didn't come from the stars. No impact, no intruder. The danger rose from within. The mantle stirred. Magma welled up through ancient fractures and spilled across the land for hundreds of thousands of years. Vast volcanic fields, like wounds that would not close, opened across what is now Siberia. Lava flowed not as rivers, but as floods, sheets of heat layering themselves mile upon mile. With them came gases, carbon, methane. Not just fire, but change. Invisible change. Atmospheric change. The skies thickened, the oceans warmed, and oxygen, that fragile thread of life, began to vanish. Not all at once, but in gradients, in pockets, in silences. In the oceans, the layers stratified. The surface stayed light, but the deep grew heavy with poison. Hydrogen sulfide bloomed in black zones below, where life once thrived in abundance. Fish lost their territory. Reefs collapsed. The water forgot how to carry breath. The air, too, began to betray. As greenhouse gases built up, the planet's fever rose. Trees died standing. Rain turned acidic. Soil struggled to hold itself together. And through it all, life gasped. Not because of a single moment, but because the system, the pattern, the balance shifted just enough. Just enough to fall apart. Geologists call it a runaway, a feedback loop. One thing nudges another, and another, until there's no way back. Lava releases carbon. Carbon warms the planet. Warming releases methane. Methane warms it faster. Oceans lose oxygen. Plankton die. Dead plankton become fuel for more decay. And the Earth keeps turning, quietly, as its atmosphere forgets how to sustain what it once cradled. We only know this now because of what the rocks remember. They don't speak, but they hold stories in their chemistry. In the ratios of isotopes. In sudden bands of black shale where oxygen disappeared. In quartz grains that broke in just the right way to suggest earthquakes beneath volcanic seas. The record isn't written in words. It's etched in the breathless space between layers. A negative imprint of disaster. And what about time? How does a moment like this feel to a planet? We think in days, seasons, generations. But Earth thinks in epochs. In hundreds of thousands of years where a single process might unfold. From our view, the world simply changed. But from Earth's perspective, it may have only blinked. Was it anger? Was it entropy? Was it simply thermodynamics, heat-seeking balance, matter obeying laws too old to name? Or could it be something more delicate, more quiet, something like forgetting? Could a planet forget how to sustain life, just as a person forgets a name they once whispered in sleep? Not because they want to, just because the pattern slipped from reach. And even as the oceans turned deadly and the skies grew still, life tried. It always tries. Microbes adapted. Some species fled to higher ground. Others sought cooler currents. Some went deeper. Some grew smaller. Most failed. But a few didn't. A few bent just enough to stay. And if the air itself becomes unbreathable, what does that do to memory? Not ours, but Earth's. Could there have been voices lost, not because they never existed, but because the conditions no longer supported the telling? Could whole symphonies of behavior, migration, song, cooperation, have drifted into silence, not from failure, but from the air forgetting how to carry sound? We don't know, but we wonder, and wondering keeps us close to the edge of what we might learn. Because even now, even after all these years, the air still holds clues. Tiny gases trapped in bubbles of ice. Isotopic fingerprints on cave walls and coral skeletons. Every inhale we take is filtered through the breath of ancient crises. And yet, beneath this loss, a deeper question stirs. If the planet could turn against life once, what pulsed beneath the crust to start it all? Beneath our feet, far below the soil and stone, the earth is not still. It beats in ways we cannot hear, cannot feel, not with human senses. A slow, seismic rhythm pulses in the mantle, deeper than mountains, older than oceans. It does not rush. It does not sleep. It moves with the weight of gravity and time, shifting heat and pressure like breath drawn over eons. And somewhere in that molten silence, something began to stir. Long before any creature named time, the earth spoke in magma. Not with sound, but with rupture. From cracks in the lithosphere, fire poured upward. Not a single volcano, but a province of them, a whole region alive with eruption. The Siberian traps, they're called now. But then, there were no names. Only fire. Only flood. Lava spilled out across the land in waves hundreds of feet deep, one after another, like a memory the earth could no longer contain. For nearly 1,000,000 years, this pulse beat louder and louder, reshaping the crust, the air, the sea. This was not the violent explosion we imagine when we think of disaster. It was slow, steady, relentless. Basalt hardened in black stair-step patterns across thousands of kilometers. The land thickened, the sky thinned. Gases, invisible, binding, filled the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, sulfur, methane. They rose not in chaos, but in pattern, following the quiet logic of heat exchange, mineral release, and planetary breath. The Earth was not breaking, it was exhaling. Could it be that the extinction did not begin with death, but with breath? With this vast, underground exhalation that tipped the planet's balance? A breath too deep, too long, too full of ancient fire? We measure it now in core samples and isotopic ratios, fragments of past chemistry locked in the crystal lattice of minerals. Zircon, olivine, feldspar. They record changes we can no longer see, but can still decipher, like reading the echo of a sound long gone. We find sudden spikes in mercury, signals of volcanic ash buried in ocean sediments. We find changes in carbon isotopes that suggest the carbon cycle itself had flipped, turned inside out. The planet's lungs had changed direction, and all of it began beneath the crust. But what causes a planet to stir like that? What shifts in its center to send such signals to the surface? Perhaps a rising plume of superheated mantle, lifting the lithosphere from below. Perhaps subducted plates melting into volatile mix. Perhaps something simpler, a buildup of pressure, a geologic breath held too long. We think of Earth as solid, but it isn't. Not really. It flows, though slowly. It remembers shape, but forgets form. The crust we stand on is a raft, drifting over convection. There are rivers of rock beneath us, slower than thought, stronger than time. What if those rivers carry not just heat, but story? Not just energy, but history? What if deep inside the mantle there is a memory loop, one that repeats not because it must, but because it can't help itself? A pulse, a cycle, a rhythm we haven't yet learned to hear. It may be that the Siberian traps were not the beginning, but part of a pattern. Part of a heartbeat that spans supercontinents and extinction events. Part of Earth's own way of remembering through destruction. And if the planet speaks through lava, what else might it be saying? When the crust breaks, is it releasing pressure or reliving something? When magma climbs upward, is it just heat or is it memory reaching for the surface? Maybe the Earth forgets. Maybe it doesn't. But we, standing on cooled stone, feel only the stillness, the silence after the pulse. And yet, we know that the core still turns. The mantle still rises. And the breath beneath the crust still waits, slow and patient. And if extinction began in this hidden fire, what else, then, did it leave behind in stone, in absence, in the record of fossils that never formed? There are places in the earth where silence is not just a feeling, but a layer. Where the rock is smooth, uniform, almost empty. Not because nothing existed, but because what once existed left no trace behind. These are the quietest pages in Earth's memory. Not blank, but erased. Washed clean by time, by heat, by decay too swift for preservation. We call them gaps, unconformities, missing intervals. But perhaps they are more than that. Perhaps they are the Earth's size, long, slow, heavy with loss. In some strata, we find the sudden absence of what should be there. Corals gone, trilobites gone, shells, tracks, teeth gone. Whole ecosystems, entire food webs, removed like a sentence scratched from a stone book. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. Enough to feel the silence echo across the world's crust. Enough to make scientists pause, brush dust from bone, and wonder what it means to not find something. To expect a shape and discover only shadow. The fossil record, though vast, is fragile. It favors the fortunate, those who died in the right conditions, in the right sediment, under the right pressures. And yet, even with its gaps, it speaks. Tells us that after the great dying, the world did not just change. It quieted. The oceans lost their noise. The land grew still. It is not just the fossils we study, but the space between them. The long pause in life's rhythm. The missing verses. What if these silences are not voids, but memories in disguise? What if the earth remembers not only by what it preserves, but by what it cannot? A fossil of silence is still a fossil. An absence can still be a marker. A layer of clay where coral should be. A black shale with no shells. A slope where there should be reefs. Perhaps what's not there matters just as much as what is. Entropy plays its part. Heat dissolves structure. Pressure collapses form. But sometimes, silence isn't erasure. Sometimes it's preservation in another shape. A chemical signature. An isotope skewed just slightly from balance. Carbon levels shifting. Sulfur trails curling upward like a ghost in gas. The traces are faint, but real. They whisper that something once was and then wasn't. Could it be that extinction leaves behind its own kind of fossil? Not of bone, but of change? A transition captured in chemistry. A turning point stored in mineral ratios. A memory buried not in skulls but in sediments? And if so, what else have we missed, simply because we weren't looking for it in the right language? Some of these quiet layers span thousands of years. Others stretch across continents. Some are thin as a fingernail. Others rise taller than buildings. But they all carry the same stillness. The same question: what happened here, and why didn't it stay? It's possible that life didn't fully vanish in these gaps. Only retreated. It grew smaller, slower, adapted so subtly that it left no signature strong enough to survive compression, burial, time. What if the survivors were not grand, but microscopic? Not dominant, but resilient? What if the future was saved by organisms too humble to fossilize? And what does it mean, then, to read the fossil record as a story? It is not a straight line. It is a soft spiral, looping and broken, filled with pauses and breaths, with chapters written in shells, and others in silence. And in these silences, we find a strange intimacy, as if the earth is confessing something it tried not to say, as if loss can be beautiful, too, not because it is wanted, but because it reveals what once was. And so, as we listen to these quiet stones, we must ask, if fossils can vanish so easily, what stories of life still remain unwritten, unpreserved, unseen, waiting in the dark of the ocean, or in the memory of breathless water? And in these silences, we find a strange intimacy, as if the earth is confessing something it tried not to say, as if loss can be beautiful, too, not because it is wanted, but because it reveals what once was. Now we turn to the sea, to the vast, slow-moving blue that once held so much of the world's life. Not just the fish and the coral, not just the swarms and the teeth and the delicate shelled things, but the breath of the planet itself. For most of Earth's memory, the ocean has been a kind of lung. Inhale, exhale. Circulation through currents, tides, thermal layers, a balance of gases, a partnership with the sky. And yet, during the Permian, something began to change. Not all at once, but again, slowly, imperceptibly, until the lungs of the planet held their breath for too long and forgot how to exhale. The surface shimmered as always, still kissed by wind and sunlight. But beneath that brightness, the deeper layers began to drift away from oxygen. Down where sunlight could not reach, oxygen disappeared, and in its place came a different chemistry. Hydrogen sulfide, methane, suspended carbon. Waters that had once carried the memory of rain and river now grew still, stagnant, heavy. And in that stillness, something ancient returned. something that had waited. Anoxia, a word we now understand in sterile textbooks and lab measurements. But to Earth it was a kind of forgetting, a lapse in circulation, pause in breath. The deep waters no longer turned over, no longer welcomed the mixing of warm and cold, of surface and depth. And without that motion, without that breath, life faded. Slowly, softly, dying not in violence, but in quiet. Some microbes, old, patient, invisible, thrived. Not the oxygen lovers, but the sulfur eaters. Anaerobes who lived and bloomed in blackness. They painted the seabeds with chemical shadows. Their waste turned the water toxic. Hydrogen sulfide drifted upward, invisible and deadly. Fish swam through clouds they couldn't see, and never returned. Reefs began to dissolve. Shells thinned. Bones never fossilized. And so, the ocean, which had once cradled the first life, became a kind of forgetting. Not a grave even, but something emptier. A space where memory dissolved. Where the remains of plankton fell, unburied, unfossilized, into the black. Where silence took root not in absence, but in chemistry. We read this story now in sulfur isotopes. In layers of pyrite embedded in shale. In barite nodules formed under ancient pressures. We find clues in the slope of carbonate shelves, in the trace metals trapped in ocean crust now folded high into mountains. Clues that whisper, softly, that the sea once turned its face away from life. Could it be that the ocean, vast, ancient, aware in its own slow way, chose to pause? Not as punishment, not as vengeance, but as inevitability, a shifting of equilibrium, a tilt in planetary breath. Could it be that every ocean, no matter how vast, can forget its function? If the rhythm is broken long enough? And if oceans can forget, what else might they remember? Deep ocean trenches still hold pockets of anoxia today. Subducted slabs of ancient seafloor still carry sulfur signatures from eras long lost. Bubbles of methane still rise from thawing clathrates buried under Arctic shelves. The chemistry remains. The memory waits. And maybe, just maybe, the ocean remembers everything. Every breath it once held. Every extinction it once witnessed. Every lull in its circulation. Every bloom of strange bacteria. Every fall of soft-bodied life onto an unbreathable floor. Maybe the water holds those ghosts within it. Not as punishment, but as pattern. And if the ocean could forget how to breathe, and then one day remember again, if it could relearn its rhythm, restore its tides, and reopen its lungs to life, then what does that say about what came next? What kind of life could rise from that kind of silence? Maybe the answer lies not in the water, but in the air, in the dry hush that settled above the ocean's stillness. For even in the quietest parts of Earth, something was always moving. Something light, something ancient, dust, invisible from a distance, but everywhere, always, carried on winds, drifted across plains, lifted from the bones of vanished mountains and scattered like whispers. It did not roar. It floated, and in its drifting it remembered. Long after the fires of the Siberian traps cooled, and the oceans surrendered to their breathless hush, the skies began to carry the remains. Not bodies, not bones, but traces, fragments of rock, volcanic ash, pulverized soils from forests that no longer stood. A billion grains, each one a fragment of something that once lived or once held life. A message not in language but in texture, in chemistry, in placement. Dust as memory. What if every particle of dust is a form of time travel? Not backwards, not forwards, but sideways, across continents, across epochs. A single grain, lifted by wind, may pass over seas, over ice, over landscapes reshaped by heat and erosion. And wherever it settles, it adds a note, a faint trace, a suggestion that something else once existed, not because it needs to be found, but because it cannot help but fall. There are layers of dust locked into the geological record, thin bands rich in iridium, in ash, in mineral signatures too distinct to be coincidence. These are the breadcrumbs of catastrophe, silent announcements of endings. Sometimes we find them between rock strata like bookmarks, a chapter close, a transition. Other times, we find them deep in ice cores, frozen in place, still scented faintly with sulfur after hundreds of thousands of years. They don't say much, but what they say is enough. Could it be that the atmosphere itself becomes an archive during extinction? A rolling library of ash and particulate, written not with ink but with loss? Could the wind, in its endless circling, be Earth's most faithful historian? Not in what it says, but in what it carries? Volcanic ash is not just dust. It is chemistry, burned and blasted. It holds signatures of the mantle, of the crust, of whatever lay in the path of eruption. When it falls, it doesn't simply land. It interacts. It changes soil pH. It feeds or poisons. It stirs new cycles or ends old ones. And in doing so, it leaves behind a record not in words but in consequences. Some of this dust fertilized distant oceans. Carried across the globe, it rained down on waters choked with decay and, strangely, seeded them with nutrients. Iron, phosphorus, silica, not salvation but spark. A new possibility, a ghost of the eruption becoming nourishment for something future, maybe even for us. And what about windblown sediments? The lush plains, the desert layers, the airborne silts that wrap themselves around mountain ranges and lakes. What if these aren't just erosion's leftovers, but the soft echo of the world rearranging itself? The Earth's way of redistributing memory, scattering it wide so that no one place holds all the grief. Entropy tells us that everything breaks down, but it doesn't say how gently it happens. It doesn't say how beautifully dust can fall, how quietly it can hold onto information, like the spores of forgotten forests, like the microscopic shells of vanished plankton, like the pollen of flowers that will never bloom again, all carried forward, embedded in time. There are theories now that even human activity is creating a new kind of dust. Plastics, heavy metals, artificial compounds that drift, settle, and layer themselves into the future fossil record. Some call it technofossil sediment. Others call it warning. Either way, we are now part of the sky's collection, contributors to the next thin band of strange particles someone or something may study one day. So maybe dust is not just residue. Maybe it is record. Maybe it is the most delicate form of memory the Earth has ever known. Always falling, always forgotten, always returning. And if dust can carry memory, what might atoms remember long after the organisms are gone? The world, it seems, forgets loudly and remembers quietly. But not all memory is written in shape or shadow. Some of it lives deep within the structure of matter itself, in the balance of atoms, in the subtle ratios that linger long after everything else has decayed. These are not memories we can touch or hear, but they are there, hidden in plain chemistry, waiting, not in fossils or bones or even dust, but in isotopes, echoes that never fade. Isotopes, different forms of the same element, like siblings born from the same cosmic womb. Carbon-12 and carbon-13. Oxygen-16 and oxygen-18. Sulfur-32. Sulfur-34. Each with a slightly different weight, a slightly different way of folding into the world. They do not feel, but they respond. To temperature, to pressure, to biology, to time. In these subtle shifts, a story begins to form. Not a loud story, but a soft, consistent whisper that says something changed here. When life was abundant and oceans pulsed with breath, the ratios of carbon and sulfur were stable, predictable, even. But when life began to slip, when oceans choked and skies thickened, these balances tilted. More carbon-12 entered the system, less of the heavier isotopes. Oxygen levels in sediments dropped. Sulfur shifted, signaling bacterial blooms in oxygen-starved waters. These aren't metaphors. They are measurements, quiet footprints of catastrophe pressed into mineral. Could it be that atoms hold memory more faithfully than we do? That they carry the mood of their moment and freeze it in place for millions of years? Not because they mean to, but because that's simply how they behave when the world changes too fast. When we study extinction, we often look for what vanished. But isotopes tell us what lingered, what remained in the water, in the air, in the cells of survivors. They show us not just that the Earth changed, but how fast the oceans turned sour, how far the carbon spread, how deeply the atmosphere breathed in and then held its breath. Even today, scientists drill into rocks that once lay at the bottom of ancient seas. They analyze thin slivers of black shale or limestone, measuring isotopic content with tools so precise they can detect a change in 1 part per thousand. And in those tiny differences, entire narratives unfold. Not in words, but in weight, in the slight lean of one atom over another, in preference, in imbalance. Entropy doesn't erase these signals. Not immediately. In fact, it helps preserve them, by settling matter into more stable forms, by burying chaos in layers of calm. Over time, decay refines memory, turning volatile patterns into permanent records. A kind of forgetting that paradoxically holds on to what matters most. And yet, for all their precision, these isotopic traces are not conclusions. They are possibilities, interpretations, clues. We can measure the tilt, but not always the cause. We can detect the signal, but not always the voice behind it. Could the spike in carbon-13 mean a burst of volcanic outgassing? Or a collapse in photosynthetic life? Or something else entirely? Something we haven't yet learned to ask? Maybe the atoms know, but they don't tell. They only leave their fingerprints, light traces in stone, in ice, in the shells of tiny creatures long vanished. A different kind of fossil, one made not of form but of behavior, of atmospheric rhythm, a planetary breath. There is something humbling about that. To know that the smallest parts of matter, things we cannot see, cannot feel, might remember more clearly than any written text, any buried skeleton. And that all around us, even now, the rocks are still holding on to those echoes. Quietly, patiently, without need or urgency. So the question lingers. If atoms can record a dying world, could they also carry traces of survival? Could they tell us not only when collapse came, but how life endured through it? And if that's true, then somewhere, hidden in stone or shell, might there be isotopic fingerprints of something even stranger, of a recovery so slow, so quiet, so improbable, that it almost didn't happen at all? Because not everything vanished. Not all life surrendered to heat or poison or silence. Some of it retreated, folded inward, drifted downward. As the world above collapsed into flame and void, life, soft, small, persistent, found places to wait. Deep places, hidden places, places too cold, too dark, too quiet to be touched by catastrophe. In the depths of the ocean, where sunlight is a forgotten rumor and pressure presses from all directions, microbial life kept going. Not because it was strong, but because it didn't need what the surface had lost. These microbes, ancient, patient, invisible, survived by eating what others could not. Sulfides, methane, the slow decay of once living things. Their world didn't depend on oxygen, or sunlight, or balance. Just chemistry, just persistence. Could it be that the secret to survival is not in size or strength, but in surrender? Not resisting collapse, but curling beneath it, becoming smaller, quieter, simpler. Could it be that the ones who endure are not those who fight the change, but those who learn how to dissolve into it? Beneath the seafloor, in sediments layered thick with memory, some creatures burrowed deeper. Small worms, soft-bodied invertebrates, organisms with no skeleton to fossilize. They moved slowly, breathed slowly, lived slowly. But they lived. They persisted through the blackness, the stillness, the suffocating chemistry. Because beneath the dead zones, there were still pockets of life. Tiny havens where oxygen lingered just enough, where temperature stayed just low enough, where entropy hadn't yet claimed every molecule. Somewhere along the mid-ocean ridges, where hydrothermal vents pulse with mineral-rich water, extremophiles, the lovers of the extreme, flourished. They thrived not in spite of the heat and acid, but because of it. They had always lived that way. To them, the world above had never been normal. The catastrophe was irrelevant. Theirs was a separate timeline, a deeper one. And life on land, it didn't vanish completely either. In shaded hollows, in underground caverns, in spores hardened by evolution and time. Some plants shrank back into seeds and waited. Some amphibians clung to narrow ribbons of river where conditions held just long enough. The genetic torch passed in secret, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. We know this, not from bones, but from gaps and reappearances. From lineages that show a strange genetic bottleneck, a narrowing followed by a slow bloom. From DNA that carries the imprint of near erasure. A memory not of triumph, but of endurance. Of survival as a quiet lineage, a whisper passed between epochs. What if this was always the shape of recovery? Not sudden, not heroic, but slow, uncertain, nearly invisible. A single cell dividing, a mutation slipping into place. A population of 10, becoming 12, then 20, then waiting. Maybe life doesn't return in waves. Maybe it returns in drips. And still, somehow it was enough. Enough to climb back, inch by inch, from the ocean floor. To crawl once again toward the light. To reawaken not as what it had been, but as something new. Something born of pressure, and darkness, and loss. So we ask ourselves, is survival memory? Is it instinct? Is it chemistry? Or is it something else entirely? Something we still don't have a word for? And if life could endure in those shadows, what would the first steps back into the open world have looked like? There was no trumpet, no arrival, no green flash across the sky. Recovery didn't march, it murmured. In the aftermath of fire, when the crust cooled and the skies began to thin, the earth did not rush. It waited, not because it needed to, but because time moved differently then. Thick, slow, dreamlike. The atmosphere still heavy with what had been lost. The ocean still holding its breath. And in that long hush, time stretched out like ash falling through water. The first million years after the Great Dying were not marked by rebirth, but by pause. As if the earth itself had entered a kind of sleep. Not unconscious, but drifting weightless, dim, unhurried. In this phase, life did not bloom. It blinked, slowly, into partial memory. A few green shoots in the right soils. Tiny shells beginning again in the shallow seas. Bacteria threading their way through soft, nutrient-starved sediment. A whispering start. No certainty, no clarity, only possibility. Geology shows us this lull. A long chapter with few fossils, few signals of change. Rock layers that speak of stagnation. Red beds oxidized by desert air. Shallow carbonates forming in low-diversity seas. Thin coal seams that suggest meager forests. The world had not given up, but it hadn't fully returned either. It was resting, perhaps, or remembering how to begin again. Could it be that this quiet was necessary? That after such a rupture, the earth needed to move slowly. Not just to cool, not just to recirculate its oceans or stabilize its skies, but to forget what had come before, in order to make room for something new. Maybe memory isn't always helpful. Maybe some kinds of survival require amnesia. And yet, beneath the stillness, deep in the soil and water, life was reorganizing itself. DNA shifted. New strategies emerged. Simpler systems began experimenting again, how to grow, how to feed, how to divide and remember. There were no dinosaurs yet. No mammals. No forests as we know them. But there was momentum. Not fast. Not visible. But enough. Entropy still hummed in the background. The great dissolver. The soft decay. The law that says all things fall apart. But life kept folding itself back together. Not because it could resist entropy, but because it could delay it. Push against it. Create temporary islands of structure in a world always leaning toward disorder. And in that act, that repetition of building, breaking, and building again, something like meaning began to return. What did the earth dream of during those slow-motion years? Not images, perhaps, but rhythms. The return of cycles, evaporation and rain, erosion and deposition, day and night rebalancing their quiet argument. With fewer species and fewer voices, the feedback loops were simpler, more fragile. But they held. And within them, the seeds of complexity waited. In the fossil record, we begin to see strange forms appear. Not immediately, but eventually, the survivors, often small, often overlooked, began to diversify. New kinds of ammonoids coiled themselves into the water column. Simple reptiles wandered across warming floodplains. Ferns and seed ferns slowly regreened the edges of the silence. These were not triumphant creatures. They were experiments, attempts, echoes of the past reshaped into futures. And maybe this is what recovery truly is. Not a return to what was, but an invitation to what might be. A kind of soft recalibration. The Earth didn't rebuild the old world. It let go. It moved forward. Slowly, blindly, beautifully. And if time after fire moves like a dream, then what does that make of us, now, living in the distant wake of such a dream? Breathing the air that was once unbreathable? Walking the crust that once glowed with lava? Drinking the water that once forgot how to carry life? And still, we ask, in that long exhale of recovery, what was the first memory life began to rewrite? Maybe it wasn't a memory at all, but a pattern, a code, carried silently through the wreckage by those who survived, not in thoughts or bones, but in molecules, in the fragile spirals of life's second language, DNA. Long before it had a name, before we could see it or sequence it, this language had already learned how to endure. It didn't resist destruction. It adapted to it, not by staying the same but by changing, by letting error become instruction, letting damage become innovation. DNA doesn't fear mutation, it uses it, turns what breaks into what's possible. And somewhere, buried deep in that spiraling thread, are scars, quiet ones, invisible ones, the genetic echoes of a planet that once nearly forgot how to live. Could it be that every organism alive today carries a trace of the great dying within it? Not in fossils or isotopes, but in the blueprint of survival. A molecular memory passed forward, not because it wanted to be preserved, but because it worked, because it helped one creature, once, in some overlooked place, endure long enough to divide again. We know now that radiation, chemical stress, and environmental trauma leave signatures on DNA. Broken strands, rearrangements, epigenetic shifts that whisper to future generations. We see it in microbes that flourish near deep-sea vents, in extremophiles that repair their chromosomes like ancient mechanics, in plants that learn to germinate in poisoned soil. These aren't just adaptations, they're inheritances, messages from ancestors who lived through something we can barely imagine. What if survival wasn't about resisting destruction, but recording it? What if the genome isn't a fortress, but a diary? One written in silent loops, over and over, generation after generation, sometimes scratched out, sometimes rewritten, but always unfinished. Could it be that inside every cell is a story still unfolding? We tend to think of evolution as progress, as a climb, but what if it's more like driftwood, shaped by currents, collisions, catastrophe? DNA doesn't plot a course. It flows, tolerates chaos, and in that tolerance, it survives. Maybe that's why life didn't need to start over after the Permian extinction. It only needed to shuffle the deck, to reshuffle the instructions, to retest the possibilities it had carried all along. Some genes lie dormant for ages, switched off, forgotten, until stress wakes them, until crisis demands them, and then, like a memory triggered by scent, they reawaken. What other languages might be sleeping in us now? Waiting, watching, learning from silence. Even now, in the human genome, there are traces of ancient errors. Fragments of viral DNA embedded like forgotten footnotes. Genes that once meant one thing and now mean another. Genetic fossils, molecular ghosts. The long, quiet history of life working through uncertainty. Is it possible that this is what makes life so strange? Not its form, but its flexibility? That everything alive today is the result of something that broke and didn't quite fix itself, but adapted instead? That life isn't a perfection, but a patchwork? If so, then we are part of that story. Not just as observers, but as participants. Our own bodies carry echoes of collapse and recovery. Our immune systems remember ancient invaders. Our cells manage damage every moment. We are not separate from deep time. We are its continuation. And still we wonder, if DNA remembers catastrophe, what else does it carry? What buried instructions have yet to be read? What stories have yet to unfold? And if life's second language is change, what might it be writing next? And in that question, perhaps we begin to hear the earliest hints of a new chapter, not in genetics, but in the matter around us, in the strange, enduring fossils of the Anthropocene, or in a future where even stone may hold the story of our machines. Because if biology remembers, can technology, too, begin to leave its trace? We think of fossils as bones, shells, leaves pressed into stone. But what if the future's fossils are not organic at all? What if they are wires, plastics, the alloyed veins of circuitry curled into a sediment layer, or the faint chemical fingerprint of a synthetic polymer no organism ever made? What if long after we are gone, these will be the things that remain? Not our voices, not our names, but our materials. There is a name for this idea: technofossils. Human-made objects that might someday become geological records, not just artifacts but strata, not remnants above the surface, but pressed into it, buried, subducted, fossilized not by intention, but by process. Cities decaying into mineral memory, landfills becoming future coal seams, glass and steel merging with rock, carried deep by time and pressure. Could it be that we are already a part of the fossil record, not waiting to be included, but already inscribed? Maybe the concrete we pour, the metals we mine, the plastics we forget, maybe they are already writing themselves into Earth's next chapter. Not loudly, but layer by layer, quietly, permanently. Some scientists wonder, if a civilization like ours had risen before, in some forgotten epoch long before the dinosaurs, would we even know? Would we recognize their traces? Or would time have smoothed them away? We assume we would see ruins, but ruins decay. We assume we would find tools, but tools corrode. Could it be that we are surrounded by evidence and just don't know how to read it? Erosion removes, but it also hides, folds, compacts. It presses one age down beneath the next until only hints remain. A strange mineral deposit, a geochemical anomaly, an isotope where it shouldn't be. Maybe that's all a techno-civilization leaves. Not monuments, not memory, just an out-of-place pattern in the rock. The Earth does not distinguish between the natural and the artificial. Takes in what we leave behind, recycles it, melds it, transforms it. Our satellites will fall. Our skyscrapers will crumble. But the microplastics in ocean sediment, the artificial isotopes from reactors, the synthetic pigments too stable to decay, those may linger, they may layer, they may fossilize, not because they were important, but because they were durable. And if another civilization had come and gone before, if they, too, had built and burned and buried, would we recognize their signals? Would their technofossils look anything like ours? Or would they be so different, so beyond the pattern of biology, that we would overlook them entirely, misreading them as natural formations, odd stones, unexplained elements? Could it be that the difference between erosion and erasure is only time? That enough time turns all stories into questions? And what does that mean for us, here now, leaving behind a trail of plastic, of carbon, of radiation, of noise? We imagine history as something we carry forward. But maybe it's something we bury behind. A residue we cannot help but leave. Entropy touches even our machines. Rust spreads. Batteries swell. Circuits fail. But even failure leaves its imprint. A pattern of atoms rearranged. A layer of ash. A magnetic echo in the crust. And maybe, just maybe, there is a kind of humility in that. In knowing that our cleverness does not exempt us from deep time. That our most permanent monuments may not be our languages or our buildings, but the strange, unintended footprints we press into Earth's skin. So we wonder, if someone or something were to find these technofossils millions of years from now, what story would they read? Would they think we were advanced? Or just busy? Would they see beauty? Or warning? Would they even know we were here? And if the deepest fossils of the past could hide civilizations, then what else might be pressed beneath our feet? Not just in stone, but in stories we've forgotten to tell? Some stories, it seems, don't need to be told aloud. They unfold on their own, written not in language but in tendency, in direction, in the quiet pull toward what is simplest, most probable, least ordered. This story, the one that underlies every extinction, every collapse, every return. It has a name. Entropy. Not a villain. Not a punishment. Just a law. A rule that governs all things. The rule that says over time systems decay. Structures loosen. Energy spreads out and is no longer useful. Everything organized will eventually come undone. Entropy is not cruel. It does not choose. It simply is. It is the background rhythm of the universe, the steady hum of breakdown. And in the story of the Great Dying, entropy was not just a detail. It was a co-author. When the balance tipped, when volcanic fire spilled across land, when carbon thickened the sky, when oxygen fled the seas, entropy did not cause it, but it welcomed it. Because collapse is easy. Collapse is natural. All it takes is time and imbalance. A few degrees, a few parts per million, a few million years of quiet drift, and the dance begins. Cells stop dividing. Ecosystems unravel. Feedback loops spin out of rhythm. Decay becomes the dominant motion. And yet, that is not where the story ended. Because even as entropy pulled everything apart, something in life pulled back. Not violently, not to stop it, but to resist briefly, locally, beautifully. Life at its core is a pattern that holds a temporary refusal to dissolve. A loop of energy and form that keeps cycling, even as the universe encourages otherwise. Metabolism, reproduction, mutation, all small rebellions against entropy's tide. Could it be that life is entropy's mirror? That it rises not in defiance, but in dialogue? That the reason life began, and the reason it continues, is not in spite of entropy, but because of it? We know that for life to exist, it must increase order locally, and by doing so, increase disorder globally. A cell that divides creates complexity within, but heat without. A forest that grows traps carbon, but also channels energy outward. Order is always bought at the price of wider disorder. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the dance between life and entropy isn't a battle, but a balance. When the Earth burned during the Permian extinction, entropy had its way. Systems fell. Boundaries blurred. Complexity dissolved into chaos. But even in that moment, perhaps because of that moment, the stage was reset. New pathways opened. New possibilities arose. Recovery was improbable, but not impossible, because disorder creates space. It clears the old and makes room for the strange. Some scientists speak of dissipative structures, systems that only maintain themselves by flowing energy, by pushing back against entropy just enough to exist. Hurricanes, galaxies, cells, consciousness, these are not static things. They are temporary alignments, spirals in the current. And life, especially after mass extinction, is just that, a spiral formed from the fragments. And what if entropy doesn't just erase? What if it edits? What if the destruction it brings is a kind of sculpting, a shaping of what comes next? Maybe the loss wasn't just tragic. Maybe it was formative. Maybe the patterns that emerged after, the new ecosystems, the new genes, the new rhythms of recovery, only arose because the old ones had been undone. It's a hard thought, but not a hopeless one, because it means that from the greatest erasure came the greatest reimagining. That life, in its quiet persistence, wrote itself back into the world using the same law that nearly ended it. Entropy wrote the script, but life found a way to read it differently. And if even the deepest order can be undone, then what keeps the memory of identity intact? When everything has changed, what makes something still feel like itself? Perhaps the question extends beyond the biological, beyond genes and cells, beyond forests and oceans and the slow breath of recovery. Perhaps it reaches deeper into the idea of intelligence itself, into the possibility that we are not the first to wonder. What if there was another Another spark, long ago, buried beneath extinctions and overgrown with time. A form of awareness, of culture, of choice, lost not to war, not to ice or fire from space, but to the earth, to its crustal movements, its gas shifts, its quiet rearranging of memory. If intelligence once rose before us, how would we ever know? We scan the layers, the rock, the clay, the minerals. We trace isotopes. We look for sudden shifts, unexplained heating, spikes in carbon, vanishing species. And sometimes we find them, layers where something changed too quickly, where extinction doesn't follow the usual script, where the planet seems to pause and reset without clear reason. Could it be that a civilization once stood where now we see nothing? That their roads have turned to minerals, their buildings to sand, their voices to noise in the fossil record? Not because they were weak, not because they failed, but because the Earth itself forgets, and forgets thoroughly. The geological timescale does not favor delicacy. Everything soft is lost. Everything exposed is worn down. Even stone becomes memory dust. What chance, then, does a culture have, one based on carbon and iron and breath, to last 100 million years? Perhaps none. Perhaps the record would vanish completely. Perhaps it already has. And yet, we look. We search for technosignatures buried in ancient strata, for traces of metals that should not exist, for synthetic compounds embedded in fossil layers far too old to explain. So far, nothing clear. Only anomalies, hints, patterns that could be coincidence, or something more. We ask ourselves, would we know if we were seeing it? Would we recognize intelligence without its symbols, without its language, without its tools? Or would we mistake it for a natural formation? A strange band of magnetism, a fossilized network of unknown origin, a geochemical oddity brushed away. Entropy helps erase, but sometimes it preserves by accident. In amber, in ice, in moments of stasis, could a city, buried instantly by ash, ever fossilize? Could a satellite, fallen and forgotten, become mineral and merge with mountain? Could an entire world's effort be reduced to a layer a few millimeters thick? And if that has happened, if civilization once rose and vanished before, what did it think? What did it feel as the air turned sour, the oceans changed color, the world grew strange? Did it suspect what was coming? Did it understand? Did it leave a message? Not for us, perhaps, but for time? What if we are the message? What if the DNA that rebuilt itself after the Permian collapse carried not just the scars of extinction, but the echoes of a mind, a consciousness once expressed through different forms, now scattered into seeds, into structure, into instinct? Maybe not words, maybe not memory, but shape, curiosity, the urge to build, the need to ask questions of stars and stones. Is that too far? Maybe, maybe not. The line between speculation and possibility blurs when deep time is involved. When the years stretch so far that even mountains become fluid, and continents erase themselves in silence. Still, we keep asking, because to ask is to remember that we do not know. And in not knowing, we remain open. And if civilization can be erased so completely, then what else, what entire worlds of experience, might have vanished without trace, folded into the fabric of stone like a breath we no longer know how to hear? Maybe the answer lingers not in stone alone, but in something more delicate, something that moves but never forgets. Climate, not as weather, not as temperature, not as mere data, but as the Earth's long breath. Its rhythm, its memory, because climate doesn't just change. It remembers, slowly, deeply, with layers and pauses and swells of forgetting. There are places where we can read it. Ice cores drawn from ancient glaciers, sediment beds collected from quiet lakes, stalagmites grown drip by drip in the dark belly of a cave. These are not simply timelines. They are diaries, paleoclimate records, yes, but more than that, they are emotional traces captured through chemistry. A spike in deuterium, a shift in trapped methane, a sudden thickening of dust. These aren't numbers. They are feelings, fear, pause, collapse, and sometimes renewal. Could it be That the planet holds onto its past not just through geology but through atmosphere. That the wind itself carries trauma? That rainfall and heat and drought are more than reactions, they are echoes? Reactions, yes, but also reminders. The kind that come back not because they're needed, but because they were never resolved. When we pull a core from the heart of the Greenland ice sheet, we're holding hundreds of thousands of years of breath. Compressed air, volcanic soot, the silent signature of forest fires that burned before humans ever struck flint. Layers so fine they preserve seasons, winters stacked like pages, summers sealed in bubbles, and within them whispers of CO2 rising, of cooling, of rapid warming, of the world turning again and again toward thresholds. Climate cycles are not clocks. They don't tick. They sway, tilt, loop, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. Milankovitch cycles stretch Earth's orbit into ellipses. Ocean currents shift. Solar output dips. But even with these natural pulses, there are moments that feel too sharp, too sudden. Times when the planet's memory is jolted, as though something returned that was never truly gone. The Permian extinction was one of those jolts. Planetary fever. And though it was long ago, its scars remain. In carbon isotope excursions. In oxygen-starved sediments. In the structure of climate models still trying to understand how quickly things can fall apart. We thought we were unique, but the Earth has seen warming before, has seen oceans turn acidic, has seen skies go quiet. So we ask, are we listening to what climate is trying to say? Or are we rehearsing an old story, one it has already told, one we refuse to hear, a story where imbalance builds slowly, invisibly until the scale tips, until feedback loops cascade, until recovery becomes not impossible, but unfamiliar. Some believe that climate has no agency, that it reacts but does not remember. But maybe memory doesn't need to be conscious. Maybe it's chemical, structural, encoded in the way glaciers flow just slightly differently after a collapse, or how forests regrow with new species after a fire, or how a desert, once fertile, holds traces of pollen that suggest what it used to be and what it once may become again. And if climate holds memory, then what does that make us? Witnesses? Editors? Participants? Perhaps all three. We live inside this memory, shape it, accelerate it, sometimes forget it, but never escape it. There is an ache in the cores we drill, a kind of weight, not just in the ice, but in the realization that what we are seeing, rapid warming, vanishing species, rising seas, is not the first time the Earth has changed this much, this fast. This happened before. It may happen again. And still, we wonder, if climate is memory, what else does the planet remember, not in temperature, but in silence? In the stillness left behind after things end. Perhaps it remembers in layers, not just through ice or ash, not only through carbon or warmth, but through something deeper, the layering of loss. Fossils beneath fossils. Extinction beneath extinction. A sorrow that does not erase what came before, but buries it gently, not to hide, but to hold, as though Earth too cannot let go. Beneath the mass graves of the Permian we sometimes find older bones, creatures that lived and died in different epochs, long before the Great Dying. Their remnants pressed into deeper stone, warped by pressure, softened by time. A trilobite beneath a reptile, a coral reef beneath a coal seam, deaths separated by millions of years, now stacked like chapters in a book too heavy to read in one sitting. Could it be that extinction isn't an interruption but a rhythm? That the end of one world always lands atop the last? A cycle of layering, decay, and burial that defines how Earth remembers? Not with clarity but with weight. Geologists call these beds, bone beds, kill horizons, event layers. Places where time pooled, where a sudden absence was followed by sediment. Volcanic ash, ocean mud, river flood, and within that blanket life stopped, or fled, or simply changed. Each layer is a breath the Earth held. Each fossil, a note in a longer melody, a pause before the next movement. What if these buried lives were not erased but transformed, translated into rock, not because they were meant to be remembered, but because forgetting them completely was impossible. Even for time, there are places where fossilization is so dense, so overwhelming, that it begins to resemble a confession. A moment when the earth said, "This happened." It wasn't gentle, it wasn't fair, but it was real. A bed of ammonoids, curled in their final shapes. A cluster of therapsid skulls turned to stone beneath the shadow of an ancient lake. Each one, a sentence, a last sentence, and still deeper down more bones, more echoes, because this wasn't the first extinction, nor the last, nor perhaps the worst, the late Devonian, the Ordovician, the end Triassic, each one a collapse, each one layered beneath the next, each one pressing upward, quietly, into the weight of memory. We often think of extinction as an end, but what if it's a fold, a crease in the cloth of history, a space where time bends inward? What lies beneath isn't gone, just held differently, compressed, changed, waiting. Could it be that the very act of fossilization is a form of love? The Earth's way of preserving something it once held close. Not in amber, but in pressure, in silence, in the patience of mineral. A slow, wordless gesture of keeping. We may never know how many worlds lived before the ones we study. How many forests grew and vanished without a trace. How many oceans swelled with life only to dry or freeze or drown. But the bones speak softly through the rock. In shape, in arrangement, in the subtle trace of a tooth against a rib, or a footprint pressed into once wet clay. And deeper still, beyond bone, we find only pattern. Trace fossils, impressions, isotope hints, a memory of movement but not the mover, a ripple but not the stone that made it. The deeper we go, the less form we find, but the more mystery we uncover. Maybe extinction is not an absence, but a shadow, a lingering shape cast by what once was, softened by time, reformed by pressure, but never truly gone. And if the earth holds all these layers, if it has kept them quietly beneath our feet, then what else lies buried still, waiting for the right moment to speak again? Before the forests returned, before the towering ferns and cone-bearing giants stretched their limbs toward the sky, there was a pause, a hush on land where nothing grew tall and nothing yet reached upward. The earth, after the great dying, was bare, scoured. Its soil, stripped of life, held the memory of trees but not their presence. No roots to anchor it, no leaves to cool it, only silence and stone, warmed by sun and wind, softened by the slow return of breath. And still, something stirred. In the quiet, low and clinging to rock, the first survivors crept back. Not the trees, but the ones who had always come first. Mosses, lichens, fungi, microbes, small and ancient, older than roots, more patient than seeds. They moved not in forests, but in films, green-gray veils across stone. They breathed, barely, grew slowly, but they endured, and in their quiet expansion, they rewrote the surface of the earth. Could it be that the beginning of every new world starts with something small? That recovery is not marked by grandeur, but by persistence? Not by forests rising, but by moss unfolding? These early colonizers didn't need much. Just moisture, just mineral, just time. They didn't demand the world change for them. They changed the world by simply being. Fungi sent out delicate hyphae, threading through dust and ash, breaking down rock into the beginnings of soil. Mosses caught the dew, softened surfaces, added carbon back into the air in careful exhale. Cyanobacteria, drifting in puddles and cracks, photosynthesized like it was the first morning again. Geologists call this stage cryptogamic, hidden marriage. Plants without flowers, growth without seeds, a marriage of simplicity and time. It may not look like much, but it's everything, because without them nothing else could come. What if the first breath of recovery wasn't taken by an animal or given by a tree, but by a blanket of green no higher than a fingernail? What if these soft beings, quiet and overlooked, carried the first memory of oxygen back to the land? In this world, there were no forests to shade, no roots to break apart the stone. But lichens, a partnership between fungus and algae, did the work anyway. Slowly, quietly, over centuries they turned cliffs to soil, turned stone into possibility. Their legacy isn't in wood or fossil, but in the fact that something came after. We can still see it today, in places that echo that silence. On the slopes of volcanic islands, fresh from eruption, where moss is the first color to return. In the cracks of retreating glaciers, where black rock meets pale light and the tiniest filaments of green begin to grow. In deserts, where crusts form between grains of sand, fragile, living skins of cyanobacteria and lichen, holding the soil together one cell at a time. Maybe this is how the earth heals, not with spectacle, but with softness. And so we ask, if the end of a world is marked by fire and absence, could its rebirth be marked by something as gentle as moss? These first plants did not restore what was lost. They created something new, not because they meant to, but because life always finds a shape, even if that shape is small, slow, and barely noticed. And if the breath returned through the smallest mouths, what forms might have followed close behind, walking softly across the green, learning once more how to be alive in a world still recovering its memory? Somewhere between the return and the forgetting, between the mosses that healed the ground and the bones pressed into it, we began to count. Not with fingers, not with clocks, but with absence, with numbers etched into stone and sediment, into models and estimates and graphs that curve downward, steeply until life nearly touches zero. We call it a mass extinction, a biological event, a bottleneck. We say 90%. We say 95. We say gone. But the earth never said those numbers. The earth only whispered in the spaces they left behind. Could it be that numbers don't grieve the way memory does? That to measure the lost is not the same as knowing them? We step gently into that silence, into the emotional weight of the vanished, not just species but entire worlds. Food webs, behaviors, migrations that no longer move, sounds that are no longer heard. A single extinction event is not just a subtraction. It is a collapse of pattern, a network turned to static. And when we say 95% of marine species, we do not hear their names. We do not see the color of their scales or the spiral of their shells or the way they dance together through warm, shallow waters, unafraid. Fossils tell us something lived, but not how it lived, not how it felt to be part of a reef or a forest or a sky that still made sense. We measure what's left. We count skeletons, compare sediments, analyze gaps. But no algorithm can calculate the hum of a vanished ecosystem. No percentage can hold the texture of what it meant to belong. And yet, we keep trying, because numbers are how we orient ourselves in the vastness of loss. They are anchors, tiny weights we drop into deep time, hoping they'll catch something. A mass extinction, by definition, is the loss of most, not just many, but most. A rupture in diversity, a sharp drop in life's variation. But even within that, not all species are equal. Some are keystones. Some are whispers. Some lived short, bright lives. Others traced their lineage across hundreds of millions of years, only to vanish in silence. What if the ones we miss most are the ones we never knew? There are no fossils for feelings, no strata that capture kinship or fear or joy, and yet we know those emotions existed in some form even before names, in eyes that recognized others, in migrations that returned each year to the same places, in the slow, reciprocal rhythm of plants and insects, of predators and prey. These relationships, ancient, mutual, invisible, disappeared too, but they left no teeth, no bones, only the shape of the void they once filled. And perhaps that is what we should count. Not just the loss of species, but the loss of connection. The empty corridors in ecosystems where someone should have been. The spaces in the tree of life that now end in silence. Sometimes extinction is slow. Sometimes it is sudden. The Permian-Triassic event was both. It unfolded over thousands of years, but ended with a threshold, a tipping point. A moment when the scales gave way. And when that happened, the counting began. Not by those who lived through it, but by us later, holding the bones, peering through microscopes, trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few surviving notes. Could it be that extinction leaves behind an emotional fossil? Not in stone, but in story? Not in data, but in longing? And if so, then maybe what we're really measuring is not loss, but memory. The echo of what once was, still reaching toward us through the dust of time. And yet, if so much could disappear, so completely, so quietly, what traces might still linger, just beyond the edge of what we know how to count? Maybe the answer is not beneath us, but above. Not in the bones buried in sediment, but in the bones that rose. Because somewhere in the long aftermath, after the silence, after the moss, after the small things crept back across land and into water, life remembered how to fly. Or perhaps, it never forgot. To fly is not just to move. It is to let go of weight, to press against gravity and succeed even briefly. And strangely, it did not happen once. It happened many times, separately, independently, insects, pterosaurs, birds, bats, for different branches of life, each finding a way to leave the ground behind. Not because they copied one another, but because something in them, something ancient, something restless, sought the sky. Could it be that flight is not just a function, but a longing? There are fossils of wings that predate flowers, of dragonflies the size of hawks, gliding through carbon-thick air in the forests of the Paleozoic. There are hollow bones pressed into limestone, feather impressions caught in volcanic ash. The skeletons of the air don't last long. Their bones too thin, too delicate, but some survived. Some lingered in stone just long enough for us to see them and wonder. What was it like to lift from the ruins and feel the wind again? The Permian extinction crushed much of the world. But in time, life didn't just return, it lifted. Found lift in new ways. Not the same ways, not the same wings, but with the same impulse. Over and over, evolution sculpted the air again. Lightened bones, spread limbs, stretched skin and feathers and chitin wide enough to catch the invisible. And from those changes came not only survival, but beauty. Maybe flight is the body's way of remembering freedom. Maybe it is a response to the heavy pull of loss. A way to escape not just predators, or terrain, or competition, but memory. To fly is to leave footprints behind, to erase your trail as you go. And perhaps that is why these skeletons seem to speak differently than others. There is something ephemeral about them. Ghostly. They do not demand to be found. They offer themselves only to the careful, the quiet, the ones willing to look gently at stone. Some creatures evolved to fly, and then lost the ability again. Others never stopped. And some, we think, only glided, a halfway compromise between the safety of the ground and the uncertainty of the sky. But every attempt is a story of possibility, of anatomy bending toward lightness, of energy turned into height, of air once a boundary becoming a path. We often imagine progress as a ladder, but evolution moves in spirals. It returns, it reimagines, it revisits old ideas and tries them again in new forms. Wings once made of stretched skin appear again in feathers, again in membranes, again in structures unlike anything we expected. Perhaps possibility is not a line forward, but a pattern unfolding. And if wings can return, if life can relearn flight, what else might it remember? What else might rise from ruin? Not as it once was, but as something lighter, something freer. Flight is not permanent. Even now, birds fall, winds shift, skies change. But for a time, life climbs. It reaches into the element that once only held breath and rain and storm, and makes it home. A sky once empty becomes full. And in that fullness, we glimpse a truth, that after even the greatest loss, there is still motion, still lift, still ascent. And so we drift into the sky with them, the dragonflies, the pterosaurs, the birds, the ones who carried memory not in weight, but in wind. And if life can rise again from the ground, what else might it carry upward, unnoticed, like the invisible pollen of forgotten wisdom, drifting into time? Perhaps it carries lessons, not carved in stone or sung in air, but written in the soft undoing of things. Because while the sky belongs to the wings, the earth belongs to the rot. And it has always been this way. Every leaf that falls, every creature that fades, every cell that collapses back into soil, none of it disappears. Not truly. It is changed, rewritten, reused, and in that slow transformation something is learned. Decay is not the end. It is the beginning of movement, of chemistry, of cycles. The smell of damp leaves in the forest, the soft disintegration of a fallen tree, the quiet bubbling of anaerobic life in the belly of a marsh. These are not failures. These are transitions, not from life to death, but from one kind of life to another. Could it be that death was never an opposite to life, but a continuation? In the shadow of the great dying, when ecosystems crumbled and extinction rippled across every continent and sea, decay took over. It had to. There were no scavengers left in many places, no large-bodied recyclers. So the microbes came. They surged. Bacteria, fungi, archaea, life's smallest chemists, flooded into the spaces that grief had opened. They decomposed not just flesh, but memory. They took in what was broken and turned it into structure, into nutrient, into the raw material for resurrection. We do not often thank the rot, but without it nothing would return. Fossils would remain as they are, locked in stasis. Organic matter would stack into dry remains. But it doesn't, because the earth breathes through decay. It exhales through decomposition, and in that exhale new growth begins. Even now, decay teaches. In compost piles, in forest floors, in coral reefs built from the bones of the past. Everything we see as vibrant is built upon something that came before and fell apart. The rainforest does not bloom in spite of death, but because of it. A whale fall in the deep sea becomes a cathedral of scavengers, each one drawn by the scent of transformation. Maybe survival is not about clinging to life, but about letting go at the right moment. About knowing how to break down, how to soften, how to become useful again. Fungi, especially, are the great translators of death. They send their hyphae into wood, into corpses, into stone. They speak in enzymes, in acids, in networks so fine they feel the breath of an insect walking above. They don't ask permission. They arrive when needed, and they do not grieve. They remember differently, not in emotion, but in efficiency. And in the process they pass along knowledge. Chemical knowledge, genetic fragments, a whisper of immunity, a molecule that once deterred a predator, now carried into the roots of a future tree. What if decay is how the earth tells its secrets? Not in speech, not in writing, but in decomposition, in the slow, intimate sharing of everything that once was, with everything that might be. And what if we, too, are part of that lesson, not just as observers but as participants? The cells in our bodies know how to break down. They self-destruct with grace when needed. They recycle their parts. They understand that endurance is not the same as permanence, that nothing is meant to last exactly as it began, not because it failed, but because it's ready to become something else. And maybe this is the quiet truth life learned in the wake of extinction, that in order to survive, it had to let parts of itself die, to compost not just bodies, but ideas, behaviors, patterns that no longer worked, the old ways, the old rhythms, the ones that couldn't breathe in a changed world. So we return again to the ground, to the softened places where roots find their way through yesterday's skeletons. We breathe in the musk of rot and feel, somewhere in the air, the future being written. And if decay has always been our teacher, then what wisdom still lingers in the soil, waiting, perhaps, to grow again? Now imagine not as a scientist, but as a witness. Imagine opening your eyes for the first time in a world that has already ended once. A world that has fallen silent and then slowly remembered how to speak. What would you see? What would you feel if you were the first to return? Not the first life, no, life never truly left, but the first with eyes again, the first with awareness, the first with breath not just to survive, but to wonder. Imagine stepping into the light after the long shadow of extinction. The land would not look ruined. It would look unfinished. Sky-wide, soil-bare, oceans unfamiliar in their color, their chemistry, their quiet. Planet not empty, but paused. Could it be that perception itself is shaped by what is no longer there? That to see a world after loss is to see with different eyes, not through abundance but through absence. There would be no memory, not at first. No inherited idea of what should be. No concept of forests. No record of the songs that once echoed through canopies now lost. The creatures that emerge after extinction do not grieve, they begin. Their perception is built from what is not what was. And in that, there is a kind of purity, a stillness unburdened by expectation. To awaken in such a world is not to be alone, but to be first. The first to hear a breeze move through new leaves. The first to follow a river that flows along a newly carved bed. The first to watch a red sun rise over a coastline still finding its edge. It would not feel broken. It would feel quiet, open, waiting. And what if perception after extinction is different not because the world has changed, but because the eyes that emerge are built by that change? We think of extinction as subtraction, but it also reshapes. It sculpts ecosystems down to their simplest rules, then rewrites complexity from scratch. The organisms that come next, the eyes that open, do so with traits inherited from survival, not from conquest. They are forged in scarcity, in patience, in trial. Their senses are tuned not to the noise of competition, but to the hush of emergence. Could perception evolve to feel silence? Some theorize that early animals, even before the Permian collapse, perceived only what they needed: light, motion, shape. But after the collapse, with the world slower and less crowded, perception may have deepened. Not sharpened, deepened. The ability to notice not just danger, but change. To sense warmth in the soil or the faintest chemical traces in the air. To notice one's own heartbeat and pause. Is it possible that awareness itself is a response to endings? We often wonder what it would be like to stand on a distant planet. But perhaps we already have, not in the stars, but in the Earth's deep past. To awaken after extinction is to explore a familiar place made alien. The laws are the same, but the arrangement is new. Light bends the same, rain falls the same, but the colors are different. The rhythms have changed. The stories haven't been written yet. And what if some of those first eyes looked up and saw nothing but sky? No birds, no trees, just clouds and stars and the turning arc of the sun. Would they understand they were alone? Or would they see that space as possibility, as an invitation to begin again? Perception after extinction is not a return. It's not a rebuilding of what was. It is the birth of new context. It is the stillness of starting over. And in that stillness, everything can be noticed. The angle of the light, the temperature of the wind, the way a single blade of green moves against stone. And so we wonder if we could feel the earth that way again. Not as conquerors, but as first eyes, what might we see that we've forgotten to look for? Perhaps, then, we would finally see the rocks, not as obstacles, not as background, but as something older than memory, slower than story, more patient than time. They do not speak in language, but in layers, in folds, in the long, slow slumping of mountains, in the quiet settling of dust into stone. They move, but too slowly for us to notice. They breathe, but only in eras. Could it be that the rocks are not still, but sleeping? There is a kind of intimacy in how the earth holds itself together. Tectonic plates, massive and grinding, slide past one another like ancient bones shifting in a dream. Entire continents rise and fall as if exhaling. A seafloor subducts beneath a coast and carries with it the memory of creatures buried long before vertebrates learned to walk. The crust is not a shell. It is a surface of forgetting and remembering, a skin that holds the past in its folds. We live on that surface. We build on it. We move across it as if it were permanent. But beneath us it stirs, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The rocks beneath our feet have witnessed every extinction. They've absorbed heat, pressure, impact. They've broken, melted, reformed. They've been ocean floor and mountain peak, desert plain and volcanic throat. And each transformation leaves a record, not in words, but in structure, in grain size, in fault lines, in mineral veining, each one a trauma held in place, each one a moment of change that, in stone terms, lasted only a blink. Maybe the earth processes pain the way we process sleep, slowly, cyclically, through compression and release, through distortion and settling, through long intervals where nothing seems to happen until suddenly everything has. Even metamorphic rock, born of heat and stress, was once something else. Sandstone becomes quartzite, limestone becomes marble, shale becomes slate. Nothing is wasted. Everything is carried forward, reshaped, rewritten. Even the hardest things we know are not fixed. They bend, they yield, they endure not because they resist change, but because they surrender to it, slowly, entirely, without complaint. Is it possible that rocks remember more clearly than we do? We forget names, faces, years, but the earth forgets in a different way. It does not erase. It overwrites, not fully, just enough. Enough to carry the trace forward. Enough to mark that something happened here. A rift, a collision, a burial, a breath. And in their silence, the rocks remind us. Speed is not a measure of importance. Urgency is not the same as permanence. What moves slowly lasts. The oldest rocks on Earth are over 4 billion years old. They do not glow. They do not speak. But they hold in their chemistry the shape of a world before oxygen, before continents, before life could even wonder. They are not wise, but they are present, still, waiting, bearing quiet witness to every beginning. And maybe they are still dreaming, because even now the crust moves, oceans widen and close, islands rise and fall, mountains crumble into grains, only to be pressed again into future stone. The planet turns, and the rock sleeps on, recording without judgment, remembering without attachment. And so we ask softly, if the earth itself sleeps, what does it dream of when it dreams in stone? Maybe it dreams in fragments, in flashes, in symbols it later forgets. Maybe Earth doesn't remember everything, not because it chooses to forget, but because memory itself weathers. What if Earth forgets just as we do? Not entirely, but incompletely, like pages missing from a book we thought was whole. Whole chapters erased not by fire or flood, but by time, by movement, by silence. In geology, we call them unconformities, gaps in the record, sediment missing, rock layers tilted, warped, erased, not gradually, abruptly, as if history stumbled and left no trace of its fall. 1 million years, 2 million gone. No fossils, no clues, just a seam where something once was, a boundary where time does not flow. Could it be that planetary memory is not linear but cyclical, not intact, but patchwork? That the Earth remembers only what it can hold on to, and lets the rest fall away, like breath in the dark? The continents move, the oceans close, plates subduct into the mantle, pulling whole coastlines into molten forgetfulness. Everything that once stood, forests, rivers, cities, even bones, drawn downward, melted, rewritten, not just buried, transformed. No archive survives that, no memory, except in ghostly traces, in minerals that realign, in crystals that grow new within old. And still we build our history on what remains. We map the strata, we trace isotopes, we reconstruct climates, ecosystems, extinctions. We imagine what came before based on what was preserved, but preservation is biased. It is uneven. Not everything fossilizes. Not everything settles. Sometimes time skips. Sometimes memory blinks. Maybe the Earth does not forget violently. Maybe it forgets like we do, slowly, softly, unknowingly. A shoreline lost to rising seas, a forest turned to peat, and then to coal, its shape still warm but unreadable. A rain of ash that buries a world not in death, but in transition. Some rocks carry clear memories, volcanic tufts dated to the hour, tree rings whispering of ancient drought, ice cores with bubbles of breath from 1,000,000 years ago. But elsewhere there is silence, a blankness in the rock, a span of time where something should be but isn't. We call it a mystery, we call it a gap. But what if it is simply a forgetting? And if the earth forgets, could it also misremember? Could it rewrite? Could it take old materials and rearrange them into new formations? Like a dream that borrows faces but gives them different names? Could the patterns we read be illusions, not lies, but stories retold so many times their meaning has shifted? Subduction is a kind of erasure. So is uplift. So is erosion. The tallest mountains crumble. The deepest trenches fill. The oldest rocks are crushed, recycled, lost. And in their place, the earth grows new skin, new mountains, new oceans, new chances to remember or forget. We like to believe the planet keeps perfect records, that geology is a truth beyond question. But maybe the earth, too, has blind spots, fault lines in memory, misfiled eras, forgotten beginnings. What if entire species existed that we will never know? Not because we missed them, but because they were unrecorded, soft-bodied, quiet, gone before they could leave a mark, lost in a warm, wet layer that later washed away. How many civilizations of trees? How many migrations of creatures? How many experiments in life erased? Is it possible that we walk on a surface that knows less than we think? And yet, even in this forgetting, something remains. Not the details, but the shape, the rhythm, the pulse of change, of collapse, of recovery. The earth may not recall every name, but it remembers how to begin again. So we lean into that mystery, into the missing pieces, into the folds and seams where memory slips through. And we ask, not for answers, but for presence, for reverence, for the humility to accept that some stories may never return. And if the earth forgets this much, what else might have vanished? Not into death, but into silence too deep to measure? We turn now not to what disappeared, but to what might have remained. Not in body, but in essence. Not in structure, but in identity. When 95% of life fades away, when ecosystems collapse, climates transform, continents shift, is there something that still endures beneath the change? A thread, a shape, a breath that continues forward, altered but unbroken. Could it be that life's identity is more persistent than its parts? Species ended. Genera vanished. Niches went unfilled for millions of years. The forests of the past did not return. The reefs did not regrow in their original form. The cast of life changed so completely that the Earth, for a time, might have seemed like a different planet entirely. But even in that reorganization, even in the silence that followed, something moved forward. Not a species, not a lineage, but a tendency, pattern, a familiar pulse. We see it in the shapes that reappear. Spiral shells, once extinct, evolving again. Streamlined bodies, symmetry, eyes, wings, behaviors that emerge not from memory, but from efficiency, from need, from a deeper code. Could this be identity not as a name or a face, but as a recurring solution? Life does not copy itself exactly, but it echoes. Maybe identity is not what survives, but what reemerges. Could identity be fractal, layered? A looping form that survives collapse by existing in multiple scales, in ecosystems, in molecules, in instinct, even DNA, rewritten and mutated across deep time, still retains fragments of the past. Ancient genes, conserved through hundreds of millions of years, still shape development, still trigger growth, still remind organisms how to become themselves. Some of these sequences date back before the Permian, before vertebrates, before complexity. A whisper carried forward, not because it wanted to be remembered, but because it worked. And yet, not everything returns. Some songs are lost. Some architectures never rebuild. There are behaviors, interactions, and entire forms of being that vanish completely. They are not extinct. They are forgotten, not erased in stone, but in potential. Unwritten in the genome, the identity they held slips beyond reach. So we ask, What is identity, if not form? If not memory? Could it be intention? A direction? Could it be the will to organize? To adapt? To replicate and transform? Maybe identity is not a what, but a how. Not an artifact, but a tendency. We see this in the fossil record. A creature disappears. Another arises that does something similar, not because it remembers, but because the niche remains. Because the world still needs that role to be filled. It's not reincarnation. It's convergence. Life looping back, finding familiar rhythms in unfamiliar forms. And still, we wonder, if an ecosystem rebuilds itself with new players but the same relationships, is it the same ecosystem? If a reef forms without the original corals, but with the same balance of predator and prey, of shelter and flow, has its identity returned? Or is it something else, wearing a mask that feels familiar? Perhaps this is what identity becomes after extinction. Not a single thread, but a tangle. A field of memory that lives not in individuals, but in the connections between them. A symphony rewritten with new instruments, but the same tempo, the same longing, the same reach toward sunlight, toward motion, toward breath. And maybe that's enough. Maybe continuity doesn't mean sameness. Maybe survival isn't about being unchanged, but about becoming again. Differently, bravely, softly. So we hold this question gently, like a fossil in our hand. Did identity survive? And we look to the life that followed. The reptiles that grew large, the ferns that unfurled, the insects that danced above new rivers, and we feel, faintly, that something familiar moved through them. Something ancient, something enduring. And if something did survive, something deeper than shape, older than name, then what else might still be alive in us? Passed down not in blood, but in rhythm, in the way we grow, in the way we gather, in the way we reach again and again toward what comes next. Perhaps the answer isn't hidden in bones or breath, but in something even humbler, something soft, something overlooked. Clay, formed from broken stone, dissolved by water, pressed by time. It is not strong, but it endures, and in its layers it remembers stress. Certain minerals do not appear unless the world is hurting. Smectite, alite, kaolinite, these are not names we speak often, but they form in the quiet aftermath of pressure, in the silence after heat, in the cracks of things once whole. Clay is not simply matter, it is evidence, a symptom of change, a reaction to imbalance, and in its grain, the earth whispers what it once endured. Could it be that clay is the earth's most honest witness? Unlike crystal or quartz, clay doesn't seek clarity. It doesn't shine. It settles. Slowly, gently. It forms when rocks weather, when they are broken down by rain and air and time. And then it collects, in riverbeds, in deltas, in basins where pressure builds slowly, in quiet places where nothing seems to happen, until suddenly, everything has. There is clay at the boundary of the Permian extinction, a thin layer, rich in altered minerals, marking a moment when the world changed, not instantly, but completely. This clay tells us something unspeakable occurred, something hot, something drawn out, a signal in the chemistry, ratios of aluminum to silicon, oxygen to iron, shifts that don't just show damage, but reaction. The earth was adapting even as it collapsed. And maybe clay isn't just a record of what was lost. Maybe it's a record of how the earth learned to hold itself together. We think of rock as hard, but clay reminds us that strength is not always rigid. That softness, when layered, when compressed, when trusted, can become solid again, can be shaped, can support weight. Clay holds water. Clay holds roots. Clay becomes the vessel, the shelter, the seedbed. It does not resist change. It accepts it, translates it, becomes useful through surrender. Is it possible that the first life to return after extinction stepped on clay? That mosses crept across it, finding nourishment in its chemistry? That raindrops softened it further, allowing roots to stretch? That new beginnings grew in the residue of collapse? Not in spite of the stress, but because of it. Because clay formed. Because something gave way. Even now, Clay tells us what happened long ago. It holds pollen from vanished trees, spores from fungi that no longer fruit, ash from eruptions that reshaped continents. It absorbs, it listens, keeps things buried, but not lost. And in our hands, clay becomes story. We mold it, we fire it, we write on it. For thousands of years, humans have pressed symbols into wet earth to say, I was here, to say this mattered, to say remember this. Maybe that impulse to shape the earth, to let it shape us, is older than we know. Maybe we learned it from the earth itself, from its memory of pressure, its patience, because clay is born not from peace, but from rupture. It forms when the world breaks down, and then it becomes the ground for what's next. So we kneel beside it, this soft archive, and we wonder, if clay forms under stress, then how much of what we see today, what we stand on, grow from, build with, was born of grief we can no longer name? And if the planet writes its pain into clay, what else might it be writing, slowly, beneath our feet? Right now, perhaps it writes in silence. Not in absence, but in quiet. Not because there is nothing to say, but because some stories can only be told without words. There was a time, long after the sky cleared and the ash settled, when the earth forgot how to sing. Imagine it. No birdsong, no insect chorus, no buzzing, no chittering, no wings rasping against leaves. Just wind, just water, just the bare bones of sound. Could it be that silence, too, is an ecological state? In the wake of the Permian extinction, the world did not just lose form and function, it lost its voice. Whole branches of the tree of life fell quiet. No footsteps through underbrush. No rustle of scales across dry ground. The forests had not yet returned. The insects that survived had not yet multiplied. And the creatures that would someday call to one another from tree canopy or canyon wall had not yet arrived. We often imagine silence as peaceful, but this silence was not serenity. It was vacancy, a world holding its breath, a pause so wide it spanned continents. Not a moment, a season, measured not in days or years, but in millions of years. An era without echo. What did that silence teach life about itself? Without the noise of others, without the competition of sound, perhaps perception shifted. Maybe the creatures that emerged were quieter, more sensitive, tuned to the subtlest vibrations, the faintest footsteps, the flutter of a leaf. Maybe life, in its long silence, became more attentive, more patient, more attuned to the language of stillness. Is it possible that the evolution of hearing was shaped by that quiet? That after the collapse, the ears that reformed did not just hear, they listened? That sound became sacred because it was rare? A signal in the vast quiet that life still stirred, still tried? In the fossil record, sound does not fossilize. We cannot hear the hum of a Carboniferous forest, the screech of a Triassic flyer, or the lullaby of a Cretaceous stream. But we can trace the instruments, the bones of the ear, the spiraled cochlea, the fine stirrup that transmits vibration. The evolution of these structures after extinction suggests something curious. Life began again not just to move, but to listen. Maybe the world needed to become quiet enough for sound to matter again. Maybe the long season of silence made room for acoustic imagination, for call and response, for rhythm, for the eventual invention of song. Because song is not a necessity. It is something more. It is life reflecting itself, calling across space, marking territory, attracting a mate, expressing alarm, joy, presence. Song is identity stretched into air, and it took time for life to trust the world enough to sing again. The first new sounds may have come not from the air, but from water, gentle pulses, clicks, bubbles. Then, over time, small stridulations from insects, wing beats, the click of mandible against bark. The soundscape slowly rebuilt itself. Not a roar, not a flood, a layering, a weaving of threads too soft to measure, but too persistent to ignore. And when the birds came, when feathers finally met flight, and lungs met breath, and syrinxes evolved to twist air into melody, the earth's voice changed again. Not for the first time, but as a return. A reawakening? Could it be that silence is not the opposite of sound, but the space that allows it to evolve? Even now, when we walk through a forest and hear it alive with sound, we forget how long it took to get here. How many seasons passed without music? How many mornings rose over land that had no voice to greet the light? And still we wonder, if silence was once an ecological state, could it return? Could the world fall quiet again, not by design, but by loss? And if it did, would we remember how to listen for what comes next? For the faintest signal, the smallest breath, the beginning of another song, in a world relearning how to hear itself again. And if silence could shape evolution, if emptiness could nurture music, then what else might repetition have taught the earth? Because this was not the first ending, not even close. The great dying, vast, terrible, humbling was just one note in a longer pattern. Earth has known extinction as a rhythm, a returning tide, a breath held and then released, again and again, into the long dark. 5 great extinctions that we know of, perhaps more, buried too deep, scattered into eroded seams and vanished crusts. Time, after all, is not kind to memory. Or maybe it is. Maybe forgetting is part of how a planet survives. We like to think of extinction as a singular, tragic mistake. An anomaly, a wound in history, but what if it's not? What if extinction is a feature, not a flaw, a mechanism that resets, reopens, reimagines what life can become? Not because the Earth is cruel, but because the conditions of existence are so fragile, so narrow, so impossibly precise, that every few 100 million years, even survival has to change its definition. Could it be that life doesn't just endure extinction, it becomes something else through it? Every time the world collapsed, something new emerged, not just in form, but in structure, in complexity, in possibility. After the Ordovician silence, jawed fish. After the Devonian fall, the first forests. After the Permian fire, the ancestors of mammals. After the Cretaceous ash, the flowering plants that now feed us. Each extinction a burn, and yet also a bloom. And yet we have to ask, why return to the edge at all? Why does life not settle safely into balance, into permanence, into calm? Maybe because the universe doesn't allow stillness for long. Entropy is always at work, pulling threads loose. Tectonics shift, stars flare, atmospheres thin or thicken, oceans rise, fall, change composition. What feels stable is only briefly so. Maybe extinction is just what happens when a system can't stretch fast enough. Maybe life, like memory, can only adapt within certain margins, and those margins over deep time are never fixed. But maybe there's another reason. Maybe extinction is also about choice, not by individuals but by evolution itself, a slow, blind force choosing, over eons, what kinds of beings should continue. In this light, extinction is not just destruction, but an editing, a curation, a strange, silent author reshaping the narrative of life. And if that's true, what does that make us? Because we're not outside the story anymore. We're inside it, entangled, a species born from survival, building tools not just to persist, but to understand. We are, perhaps, the only beings who know extinction exists, who name it, who count it, who fear it, who cause it, who try to prevent it. Could it be that consciousness itself is a late bloom from earlier ends? That self-awareness arose not in spite of extinction, but because of it. A long memory stitched into neural tissue, echoing ancient loss. Maybe when we feel dread or awe or deep grief at the thought of mass death, we are remembering something older than ourselves, something buried in our cells. A whisper passed down from creatures that once watched their world fall apart and somehow it carried on. And so we loop, through survival, through erasure, through reinvention, maybe not endlessly, but often enough that the pattern shapes the planet. Enough to raise a new kind of question. If extinction has always followed life, what happens when life begins to anticipate it? What happens when we become not just survivors, but stewards? Or do we forget too easily, like the layers that erode, like the cliffs that fall into the sea? The loops still echo, in biodiversity's slow rebound, in the fossil gaps, in the shifting isotope curves, in coral bleaching, in ice cores, in sudden die-offs we don't yet understand. The rhythm hasn't stopped. It only quiets, then starts again. And yet, if we can recognize the pattern, might we break it? Or is the loop part of something deeper, a truth about change itself, about the necessity of letting go? And if the Earth has let go so many times before, what else might it be preparing to release again? But even release is never complete. Not once, not ever, has life vanished entirely. Not in the firestorms of the Permian. Not in the frozen hush of snowball Earth. Not in asteroid shadows or anoxic oceans. Each time the page was nearly turned, something small kept its place. A whisper clung to the margin. A breath beneath the ash. What is it that refuses to die? Some call it chance. Others chemistry. But maybe it's neither. Maybe there is something else in the equation. A strange defiance baked into the earliest molecules. An urge to hold on. To replicate, mutate, adapt. Even when there's nothing left to adapt to. Even when the sun itself seems cruel. Even when air turns poison and water rots in its own stillness. Life does not shout back. But it stays. In the deepest thermal vents, where light has never arrived, bacteria bloomed. Ancient, unshaken, self-fed by sulfur and stone. In salt pans and acid lakes, spores slept for thousands of years, waiting for gentler days. In burrows beneath scorched soil, creatures too small to notice the sky kept digging, eating, reproducing, never knowing they'd inherited the world. Maybe survival doesn't require knowing. Maybe it just requires presence. And so the spark continued, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, not through grand vision, but through stubborn function. DNA curled around itself, folding memory into resilience. Not because life is brave, but because it is persistent. Not because life understands, but because it tries anyway. We look at mammals, birds, trees, ourselves, and trace our ancestry to creatures that should have died. And yet, they didn't. Somewhere in the thick night of extinction, they were missed, overlooked, lucky, or maybe designed by eons of pressure to be exactly what the Earth could not erase. Is it possible that extinction itself selects not just traits but temperaments? That life becomes unkillable not through strength, but through flexibility, through humility, through the quiet arts of hiding, shrinking, softening, waiting? The unkillable spark doesn't burn brightly. It glows. It hums. It survives not by conquering, but by yielding. And we are its heirs. Every breath we take contains atoms exhaled by ancestors who never saw the stars. The carbon in our bones once spun inside a fish that survived a sea with no oxygen. The proteins in our cells remember temperatures the surface no longer knows. Maybe what we call intelligence is just what the spark looks like after 4 billion years of adaptation. Or maybe we're just its newest vessel, not its end, not its goal, just its continuation. And if so, what now? What do we owe this spark? This thread that's stitched through 5 apocalypses to arrive, trembling, in our chests? Do we protect it? Do we preserve it? Or do we burn too hot, too fast, thinking we are separate from what made us? Perhaps resilience has its limits. Perhaps even the spark can be scattered if we forget its origins. Because it does not belong to us alone. It belongs to the planet, to the process, to the pattern. And yet, how strange, how quietly astonishing, that we can ask these questions at all. That a spark, once buried in volcanic rock, now contemplates time, entropy, and its own endurance. Could that be the spark evolving? Could memory itself be the next survival trait? A kind of fossil in the mind, not of bone but of understanding. And if understanding can survive, if wonder itself becomes durable, then maybe, just maybe, the next extinction won't come from forgetting. And yet, if we carry the spark forward softly, with care, what other fires might we learn to light? Because somewhere in the slow spiral of our DNA, there lingers an echo not shaped by language or thought, but by endurance. a murmur of the Permian, a time not remembered by minds, but by cells. Not because we were there, but because something before us was, and it survived. It watched the world end and begin again, and left a whisper behind, deep in the machinery of life. We are that whisper now, dressed in flesh, breathing air, thinking thoughts we call modern. But beneath the surface, the old pulse still moves. Mitochondria, those ancient powerhouses in our cells, trace their ancestry to life that saw oceans turn black. The sulfur pathways in our biochemistry still echo the chemistry of a planet gasping. And maybe even our fears of fire, of stillness, of emptiness are not all our own. Maybe they are memories, inherited not through story, but through survival. Could it be that anxiety is a kind of fossil? That restlessness, alertness, the racing heart, are shadows of an age when extinction was close enough to feel? When every vibration in the ground meant danger. When every silence in the air was a warning. Maybe the ghost of the Permian doesn't haunt us with images, but with instincts. We flinch not because we remember, but because something inside us does, and still we adapt. We walk through cities of steel and glass, and yet our veins carry blood warmed in a world where forests collapsed. Our fingers type and swipe and hold, but they evolved from limbs that once crawled across scorched, oxygen-starved ground. The curve of our spine, the structure of our skull, the chemistry of our breath, each a quiet record of past catastrophe. Adaptation isn't always about progress. Sometimes it's about remembrance, a way of embodying lessons we never learned consciously because the teachers died before they could speak. Could resilience itself be an inheritance? Not a trait of the mind, but of the body, built bone by bone through epochs of loss. We are the descendants of organisms that learned to bend, to twist, to burrow, to shrink. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And in us, that need has become a drive. A need to explore, to innovate, to survive things we haven't even imagined yet. Perhaps that's the ghost's gift. Not fear, but determination. Still, ghosts do not always comfort. Sometimes they stir at the edge of sleep. In quiet moments, when the modern world fades and only the wind remains, we feel them. Not as voices, but as a presence. A weight in the chest, a thought we didn't think. The sense that we are not entirely new, that we are built of echoes. And maybe that's true. Maybe we are not blank slates, but palimpsests, rewritten over and over, each version faintly visible beneath the next. The Permian still whispers beneath our bones, beneath the way we shiver when the world feels unstable, beneath our longing for connection, for continuity, for meaning. Because something inside us remembers rupture. It remembers what it took to continue. And so we ask, what do we carry that we cannot name? What instincts kept our lineage alive and still shape us unknowingly? What if the Permian never truly ended? What if it lives in our reaction to scarcity, our fascination with fire, our dread of silence? Not because we're fragile, but because fragility has always been the price of complexity. Maybe the ghost of the Permian in us isn't a spirit, but a rhythm. One that beats slower than thought, deeper than breath, older than fear. And yet, if such ghosts can persist across hundreds of millions of years, what other memories might life still be holding on to, just beneath awareness? Perhaps they would see something faint, something barely there, like breath on glass. A whisper, suspended across ages, waiting to be heard again. Not a monument, not a warning, not even a message, really, but a pulse, a faint continuity, a hush that says, we were here, and so were they, and so are you. A thread that doesn't need words, just presence, just survival, just one life leading to another, like moss growing in the cracks of a crater. This is the echo of deep time, a murmur that moved from magma to microbe, from trilobite to tree, from fern to feather, from silence to sound and back again. We stand at its end, or maybe its middle, inhaling its dust, drinking its memory. The minerals in our bones, the carbon in our breath, the iron in our blood, all once part of that silence. all once folded into rock, into sea, into extinction, into renewal. And yet here we are, still, breathing, not because life is triumphant, but because life is stubborn, not because it always wins, but because it refuses to lose completely, because it shifts, because it weathers, because it forgets and remembers all at once, because even in the deepest, most entropic quiet, something flickers forward, something holds on, not loudly, not brightly, but gently, patiently, like a lichen waiting on a bare stone, like a whisper, tracing its way through eons. Could it be that all of this, the rocks, the fossils, the collapse, the return, was never meant to be read like a book, but felt like a song? A rhythm, looping softly beneath the planet's crust. A memory not stored in words, but in patterns, in ratios of isotopes, in layers of clay, in absence and presence, in bones, in silence, in breath. Maybe the great dying was not an end at all. Maybe it was a breath between notes, a held inhale before the next line of melody. Maybe the earth paused. Maybe life listened. Maybe the silence that followed was not despair, but rest. Not emptiness, but preparation. And maybe now we stand at another breath, another stillness, a place that feels like decision, not because we are the center of the story, but because we are within it, woven into its dust, its clay, its data, its decay. We are not above it nor below it. We are one more echo, one more carrier of the whisper. And what now? What will we do with it? Will we listen? Will we slow down enough to hear what deep time is saying? Not in sirens or alarms, but in patterns. In the oceans losing their memory. In the forests shifting north. In the air holding more heat than it used to. Will we hear it not as fear, but as invitation? Invitation to wonder, to reimagine, to loosen our grip on permanence, to be less certain and more careful, not out of guilt, not out of panic, but out of awe, out of reverence for what has already survived, and for what still might, because life has already written itself into disaster and rewritten itself out again. So the question isn't, can life survive us? It's, can we live in a way that listens? A way that feels the sediment beneath our cities, the ancient seas beneath our feet, the extinct voices that made our oxygen possible. A way that hears the whisper, not as noise, but as guidance. And if we can live in that kind of stillness, that kind of attention, then maybe this won't be a story of endings. Maybe this will be one more loop, one more breath, one more soft survival. A continuation not despite collapse, but with it, through it, beyond it, because the whisper hasn't stopped. Not really. It's in the wind, in the soil, in the dust on the shelf, in the sleep of rocks, in the rhythm of cells, in the breath you're taking right now. And if you listen not with ears but with something older, you might hear it too. Just beneath the noise, just beneath the fear, a voice without language, a memory without shape, a whisper through deep time.